All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Brisbane Azure User Group. Hopefully everyone can hear this. Thumbs up, Dan, if we're alive and going. I think that's a smirk. That's good enough. Awesome. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Brisbane Azure User Group. We're live streaming with Teams live stream. So just a few things before we kick off with the main event. First of all, June, I want to acknowledge our sponsors. So our sponsors are kindly putting this together for us and helping us do everything we're doing. So thanks very much for Codify and Microsoft for supporting this event. Getting involved is really important with the Azure User Group, and we've got a few opportunities at this stage for everybody to get involved. A few things left for this year, so if you are keen to getting involved with the user group, let myself or Dan Toomey know, and we can organise and get you a spot. There's plenty available at this stage, so jump in and get involved. A couple of updates. So I'm not going to do all the updates since last time because Todd is going to cover a lot of things in build. So just a few things that not sure if Todd's covered. I just want to get these updates out there. A few things that were really cool. Front Door has got a bunch of new things in their rules engine. So that really improves the capability of that service enormously. So jump in, check out Front Door. There's all sorts of things you can do in this rules engine, mainly around the headers and redirecting and all that sort of stuff. But that's doing those things on the edge rather than doing that in one of the Azure regions itself. So it's really important to do that sort of thing for your web apps. Blob Storage, look, there's a bunch of things that dropped for Blob Storage. Geo-zone redundant storage, account failover where you can actually initiate the failover yourself, versioning on your blobs, and the ability to go back to different previous versions, and point-in-time restore. So that pretty much covers the few things I wanted to point out. We've got a bunch of resources, so get involved with the Slack channel or YouTube. There's a bunch of training things that's really relevant for Azure resources, so you can get involved there and learn stuff. And then some really important blogs that I'd point out to you. So these blogs are great. You should definitely check them out if you haven't before. Tonight, so without any further ado, we've got Todd Whitehead. So everybody knows Todd. He's been here nearly every Azure meeting that we've had. So if you don't, say hi because Todd's here, and he's going to give us a bit of a roundup of the new things that have dropped for Build 2020. So without any further ado, Todd, take it away.
Awesome, thanks, Damien. I'm just going to switch my little screen here. So what we're going to do, oops, let's go over here. Yes, excellent. So good evening, everyone. So what we're going to do tonight, we're going to go through what I've called the best of Microsoft build, with the big caveat that this is completely unofficial, Todd's version of reality that may or may not match actual reality. We certainly, unfortunately, can't cover everything at build, but we will cover all the things that jumped out as me as being of interest to a lot of people. So just for those who don't or aren't aware, so Microsoft typically each year runs two very large events, one being Build, which is very much aimed at developers, and then Ignite, which is more originally, I guess, aimed at IT pros. I think the reality is of a cloud world, those two audiences now are so blurred that there's really something for everyone in both of them. But Build definitely has a much more developer-friendly vibe. Come on, Mr. Mouse. There we go. So put together what I laughingly called an agenda. There were so many announcements in different sessions and different formats that there wasn't really an easy way necessarily to break down the updates. So what I've done is kind of break them down into these groups. So first of all, I just want to just kind of pause, I guess, and reflect on this build. It's obviously very, very different from previous builds with everything going on in the world. And kind of the way I've broken it up is around dev tools, and then looking at web development more generally, integration, infrastructure, data and AI, and then finally IoT. So we've also got some breaks in amongst those sections. So please feel free, any questions you've got, put them into the Q&A window, and at those breakpoints, Dan will kind of consolidate those, and we'll answer any questions we can as we go through. All right. So yes, as we all know, things have been very different this year. We've all been kind of working, learning, living from home, and probably spending way more time with our families than we expected to earlier in the year. And I think it's probably fair to say that the whole working from home thing, as in a lot of companies and for a lot of people, was not looked on favourably. And I think that's probably something that's really a positive that's come out of what's gone on this year. That I think people have really, now that they've experienced it, hopefully changed it a little bit. Certainly, this is a shot from our house. I've got four children at home learning. They got to learn way more about Scrum and Scrum boards than they probably thought they were going to, but actually got in and really enjoyed it. So I think between working in that way, lots of Zoom meetings or team meetings or Slack or whatever every school was using a different approach. They probably got exposure to a much more work-like environment than probably they have before. So I guess on that, one of the interesting things they highlighted at Build was just things like Teams, for collaboration, just the unbelievable rise in usage in a very short space of time. So that's, I guess, not just the technical aspects of people using it, but people learning how to work in that kind of online collaboration way that potentially haven't done so before. So you can see the incredible spike there between March and April. But what's really interesting, if you kind of peek behind the covers, and again, being kind of technical people, now there's no numbers on this graph, but I don't think you need numbers. When you realize the scale on the left is the number of cores in Azure that Teams is using, and that scale is in millions. So you can see the more than exponential growth there of Teams over that time. And the reason I raise that is that Teams itself is built on the same serverless and core infrastructure technologies that you use. So it's not built on anything different. So it does, I guess, show the power of using these kind of serverless architectures, being able to scale massively if and when you need it. So I thought that was kind of an interesting peek behind the curtain. Oh, before we go on. So, sorry, jump back. So yeah, so the build event obviously was very different this year, and kind of quite bravely, I think, the team that put it together, because if you've ever seen one of these events or like been lucky enough to be to one, they're absolutely enormous arena spectacular style events. You'll go into a room of 20, 30,000 people, and it's just kind of crazy with all the big sound effects and lighting effects. So obviously this year was very different, and as I said, quite bravely, they opted to do it on Teams with live crosses and probably really captured the feel of everyone's working from home. So what I want to do is just show a quick 1-minute little intro video they set, which just to kind of set the scene and maybe go and encourage you after this to go and have a look at some of the sessions.
Mark, where are you, Mark? Turn your camera on.
Okay. You can see me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see you.
Hey, friends. I'm Scott Hanselman, and I was told to give you a tour of my office. This is Nerds Nerding. What we're doing is we're talking to people all over the world because we're stuck in our houses. We're looking at
God, this is like my dream come true. I always wanted to join Scott Hanselman's group.
What do you want? All right, so that was just a little flavour. Well, more than a little flavour. There we go. Of I guess what the build event was like, and yeah, as I said, I thought very brave when they did a lot of this in real time over Teams, people on phones, and all sorts of things. So it was very interesting to see, and I think probably captured a bit of the sense of the time as well as being a lot of fun. So one of the things I mentioned, it is a developer conference. So just kind of a little highlight. Satya mentioned in that intro, you know, this is real nerds nerding. And there's plenty of Easter eggs for those that are interested to go through and have a look. If you notice behind Satya there, that little strange series of letters, which of course, if everyone is fluent in base64 encoding, will realize that it says devs. And even through to things like on Scott Hanselman's background, you'll see there's a whole lot of little clues about things they're working on there. So for example, that Microsoft Edge browser might be coming to Linux. And of course, being a retro nerd, my all-time favorite was the fact they actually had the Amiga Boeing demo just randomly sort of playing on the side half the time. Just little stuff like that. And then, of course, just to round out the retro kind of thing, they did feature little things like this, a nice little ASCII terminal-based tool for managing your Azure virtual machine scale sets. So yes, very, very nerd-focused and nerd-friendly. So the build event itself obviously covered a huge range of technologies. I'm going to focus tonight on really two areas. The core Azure stuff itself. So I'm not going to focus on, and there was a whole series of streams on the Power Platform. So Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate. There's a whole lot of great stuff on that if you're interested, you should definitely go and check out. I'm really going to focus more on the Azure side of things, but I'm also going to focus on a couple of the announcements related to GitHub, because I think it's interesting when Microsoft acquired GitHub not that long ago. I guess there was a lot of speculation and it was unclear how that was going to play into the Microsoft strategy. And so I think in the build event was the first time where we really started to see some of this integration land and kind of give us a bit of a feel for where things might be going. So I will touch on a few little parts of that. All right, so let's jump straight in. So this first little section is really all about dev tools, and we won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to kind of go through some of the announcements related to this. So it was announced that Windows Terminal, which has been available for a little while now in kind of preview, is now version 1.0. If you haven't used it, you should. It is awesome. As we kind of go into this cloud world and hybrid cloud world where we're using different operating systems and different environments and containers and all sorts of stuff, more and more the command line is becoming very important. And the Windows Terminal is incredibly flexible in terms of giving you a way to access terminals in whatever kind of environment, be that Windows, Linux, containers, whatever. It's a fantastic tool. Similarly, the Windows subsystem for Linux had a few announcements. So if you haven't used version 2, you should definitely do that. The performance improvement is quite remarkable. Version 2 is now available, and you can flip. One of the nice things is you can, if you have an environment, it's very easy to migrate environments between version 1 and 2, going forwards and backwards. A couple of interesting things they did announce. They're obviously working on, initially, it's the subsystem for Linux was obviously very focused on just giving you that access to that Linux kernel and being able to run those tools locally. But a couple of things they announced. One was that they've put a lot of effort into leveraging hardware acceleration, particularly around the GPUs, the video cards, for a couple of different reasons. They've also integrated very nicely into things like the Windows File Explorer. So if you go in now and you've got this running, you'll see on your left side there, you'll get a little Linux icon, and there'll be the file systems for all the Linux environments you're running locally, and you can just browse those and use the native file system. That video card acceleration I mentioned, there's kind of two different scenarios for that. One is something like this demo they showed, where basically in their subsystem for Linux, they're running some TensorFlow, training some AI models using TensorFlow. And you can see from the task manager graph there that it's to do that, it's leveraging all the CUDA cores on the GPU. So all those sort of hardware features are now available in the Linux subsystem. The other one, which they demoed, is not available yet, but is coming soon, is it will also natively built in support the ability to run Linux graphics apps. So if you have, you're on GIMP or any other kind of graphical Linux windowing based system, you'll be able to run those utilities as well without having to install any other kind of third-party Windows servers or anything. They also announced the release of Windows Package Manager. So if you've ever on Linux used something like apt-get, or on Windows previously, if you've used things like Chocolatey, this is a command-driven way to find and install software easily and consistently. So for example, you can go in, if I did this, search the repository for, say, Azure tools, and if I want to install the Storage Explorer, I can just do a winget install Storage Explorer, and away you go. So very much that kind of model for managing software packages, which again, for going through environments and scripting setups and everything is really useful. All right, so moving kind of off, I guess, command line tools, he was one of the big ones for me. This has kind of been talked about in preview before, but I think build was really the first time we started to see what this code spaces thing could do. So if you haven't heard of code spaces, you can think a bit about this as separating out where you have your development UI from where your development environment is actually running. So for example, you can, and I'll go in and show you this in action in a sec, you might be using Visual Studio Code on your laptop, but your actual environment might be running in a container somewhere with the exact set of requirements you need. So getting an environment set up is very easy. If you're flicking between projects, you don't need to worry about all those different kind of requirements and conflicting requirements. And it also means you'll be able to access it from wherever you want to go. So just to explain what that is. So, if Visual Studio Code is great because it's been written for the ground up for this sort of thing, right? So there's really two parts: the UI bit where you get all your menus and all your graphical stuff, and then there's the code part that actually runs the language and runs the extensions and does all those kind of things. But with code spaces, what you can effectively do is all that second part can run anywhere. So for example, that environment might be on your Raspberry Pi. It might be a container-based system. So you're still using the GUI on wherever you want, but the environment itself is operating in the context of the thing. So to make that a bit real, when you go into Visual Studio Code, you can see you can get a nice little drop down here, and you tell it what you want to do to do this. It could be a container, like just a generic container. It could be SSH if you've got, say, a Raspberry Pi, a Windows subsystem for Linux, or code spaces. So code spaces is the managed environment will run on your behalf, and you can see there, once you pick that, it runs off and creates an environment for you. Come back to that. So once you're in there, I'm in Visual Studio Code, doesn't look that radically different, but if you'll notice the in the bottom left there, the little green section tells you where you're running. This is actually running in code spaces. So these files are not on my local machine. Okay, and if you look at the terminal here we've created, it doesn't say C:, whatever. This is actually a terminal running in the context of wherever this is. All right, so as we do more and more kind of container development, remote development, cross-platform development, this becomes amazingly powerful. And yeah, you can see here, for example, in this little website, you're going to see a little bit more of. Even though I'm running Windows here, the actual BS Online environment is a Linux environment, and I'm running some Linux-based tools to go and install some things and work in that environment. So if we have a look just quickly, if I can get my little zhuzhing, what I'll connect. So that was that. I was accessing that environment there through Visual Studio Code. But equally well, I can go to Codespaces online and access it from a browser. You know, and you might, I guess, if you haven't seen this, you might think, you know, that we've seen before kind of code editors in a browser and things like that. But this is a lot more than that. Basically, what this is the browser is going to provide the front end, and everything else is going to be running inside that containerized environment. So here I am in my web browser. If I close down the welcome screen, I think we already feel welcome. It's just loading up here as that loads up. So a couple of things you'll notice. One, you'll notice that the color scheme here is black because this is the dark theme that I like to use because I've got really old eyes. So it knows not only is it taking a containerized environment, it knows that what settings I like to do in Visual Studio Code, and it's configured that in the code spaces for me. So you can see here the experience is very, very similar with the files. Here, click here, we get all the usual kind of good things we'd get, as you'd expect. Code lining, all the things look the same. I can debug, I can run the same. But even if I click here on my extensions, even the extensions I have installed are installed and work. So everything I can do in that other environment, I can do in this environment. Everything's through there, from the source control, changes, I can go and look at whatever. So basically, this is my dev environment. And just to kind of prove this, similarly, I could come in here. I'm going to run a terminal here in my browser, and you'll see here it's the same environment. So this is that Linux container that's running in the background with all my dev tools installed exactly as I need for this project. And hopefully I'll be able to say, you know, do something very useful in Linux, because that's what we do in Linux, and go out of those apps. So this is a full Linux environment. So I actually use this a lot when I'm developing on the Raspberry Pi. So all my code runs on the Raspberry Pi, but I use VS Code on my PC, and I'm just using SSH to do exactly the same thing. So that's kind of getting to the point where this stuff is seriously impressive and cool. We kind of talked about that, didn't we? Yep. So very good. So that's available now in VS Code and via the browser. It's coming for Visual Studio. Obviously, Visual Studio, a product with a bit of a longer legacy. There was a lot more work for them to do, but that is coming soon. But some of the great things that they did announce in terms of Visual Studio is Intelli Code. And if you haven't seen that, you should have a look. So don't confuse Intelli Code with IntelliSense. So IntelliSense has been there for quite a few years, which is, you know, once you type it, you know, it gives you what are the valid options for the next bit of, you know, the next parameter or the next whatever. Intelli Code is AI infused into your environment. So they developed an AI model by analyzing a gazillion, maybe not technically accurate, but projects on GitHub, and looked at things like, you know, what is good programming style? What do people normally do when they do these kind of things? So the prompting you're getting is around things like best practices. How do people normally use this stuff? So it's way beyond just thinking about what are the valid next commands. It understands that. And there's some preview versions out for the new one in there. They also announced .NET Core 3.1, which is a long-term support. So that has years and years of support. Also includes WPF and Windows Forms support. So basically all of those platforms you can now develop in the cross-platform .NET Core, and a whole bunch of other good stuff. And Damien's favorite, I'm sure that he can now do browser-side ASP.NET Blazor. So if you want to develop client-side frameworks, but you're more of a back-end developer, you can use that and use your C# skills to work on the client end, just like those cool JavaScript kids. Cool. So there was that. So the other thing they did have a lot of focus was around GitHub Actions. So on GitHub, Actions are their CI/CD tooling. So for all your automated build and deployment, and there's a huge marketplace of those. So GitHub for Actions, GitHub Actions for Azure, I should say, have been on there for a little while, and it's a growing library. But one of the things they did announce and show is that those you will now find those actions and the ability to use GitHub as a CI/CD platform actually built into things like Visual Studio Code, the CLI, and the Azure portal. So if we have a look here, for example, so if you create a web app in Azure, Previously, when you configured it, you could pick from, Azure repos for your source, Bitbucket, local Git. You'll now see there is the option for GitHub Actions. So this is not just using Git as the repo, but this is actually hooking into the CI/CD ecosystem of GitHub and using that. So there's a lot of good stuff on that. The other thing that I kind of came across this by accident, and I thought it was incredibly cool. So is called the GitHub Dependabot. So the Dependabot is an AI tool built into GitHub that will look at your code and help you fix vulnerabilities. So here, for example, is a wonderful website I built for my C64 demo, and I haven't touched it in a few months, you'll notice. And I went in to have a look at something, and you'll see here it's popped up, and it said the Dependabot has found potential security vulnerabilities. So some of the open source libraries I've used, a new vulnerability would be discovered. So that's handy, that's nice. But what do I do about it? Well, I can drill in and I can see exactly what the libraries are, how high risk they are. Okay, that's kind of good and handy, but what do I do about it? But what it will also do is create automatically a pull request and update in that pull request the code I need to do to fix it. So it will basically fix the problem for me and create that as a pull request. And then really all I need to do, and I can go and browse it. And in this case, for example, it was just bumping up a add-in version from 1.31 to 1.32. So that was all it was, bump up that dependency, but it's there as a pull request, so I can review it. And then once I'm happy with it, all I literally do is click merge pull request, and that's fixed. What I've seen a lot of people have done, they've got to the point now where this is so good and they trust it so much that if it's those kind of things, they automatically approve it. So if you want to do that, you can, but otherwise so the bot's basically following your exact kind of development methodology. So one more thing. Oh, and the other thing I was impressed with that. So in my particular case, there was 6 more it didn't raise a pull request for. And I couldn't work out why until I tried to go and fix it. And it turns out it was one of those really interesting situations where to fix one version of a library, you had to update another one, but updating that one introduced a vulnerability to something else. So I was kind of impressed that Dependabot recognized not only that it recognized there was an issue, but it also recognized fixing it was complicated. You had to upgrade multiple libraries in a certain particular order. So it just flagged it and left it for me to do. So I actually thought that was pretty good that it could discriminate between those. So that's kind of the end of the dev tooling section. So Dan, I'll just pause there. Is there any questions, or we'll keep flying on?
There is actually no questions at this point. I hope everybody realizes they can use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and we'll stop and take time to answer those.
Sure, no worries. Okay, that's good. We'll play on. So this next one again. Okay, so Code Spaces was one of the ones that really excited me. Now we're moving into, I guess, more Azure services, and this one equally well really excited me. So, one of the big architectural trends, I guess, over the last few years is to use obviously serverless technologies, but especially in terms of building very, very scalable web apps. So Microsoft have very well-known patterns, but and there's a bunch of frameworks written around this, right? So this could be either something like React or Vue, where it's actually a JavaScript client-side framework. So all the content for the website is rendered on the client, and it just calls APIs when it needs to get its dynamic kind of content. So that's kind of one model, very popular and very scalable. And the other is where you might use something like a publishing model. So for example, a lot of blogs now use things like Jekyll or Hugo, so that you author your content in Markdown and then you run it through this process and publish the static output. And I did this so that, again, I mentioned the Commodore 64 demo I did before. Part of that was I built a website and I used this method. Now, in order to do that, I could do all of that in Azure, but I had to set this up and wire it together. So I needed a Blob Storage account to host the files. I needed to configure the CDN to replicate those out. I needed to build a CI/CD pipeline to move all the things between it. And then when I had that interactivity with an Azure function, I had to connect that up, wire it up. I had to configure custom domains. So although once it was up and running, it was simple, there was a lot of work in kind of figuring out and understanding all that. And I was thinking at the time, you know, it'd be really handy if there was just a service that did that for you. Well, now there is, creatively called Azure Static Web Apps. So this pretty much does exactly what I had in my architecture diagram. So this gives you a higher level service that's specifically targeted at building and deploying these static style web apps. So it's and has great integration. It uses the GitHub workflows and provides sort of seamless ways. So if we go in, if you go into the Azure portal, you'll see there's a new service you can create called Static Web App. Not terribly surprising. You literally give it the usual kind of parameters, not a lot. But one key thing notice is at the moment the source has to be hosted on GitHub because it does use heavily GitHub Actions to do this stuff. And you nominate a branch for your code. Once you do that, you'll get a static website set up. So you can see there the URL, and I kind of like how they now generate these interesting random URLs instead of getting you to try and guess one, because it's gotten to the point now, I guess, where it's very hard to come up with a unique name. But what you'll also notice is that it's mentioning there a workflow file and GitHub action runs. So this has created this environment. It's connected this up to the code repository I pointed to, and it's also configured the CI/CD pipeline for me and checked that into my source code. You can see on the left here, all those kind of things that I mentioned I had to do. So custom domains, functions, role management, so role-based access control, and different environments, you know, dev versus test versus whatever. That's what this service does, all built in, and brings that together for you. Oh yeah, look, I even highlighted them. There we go. And if the actual file that it created is this YAML, which is, if you've ever seen in Azure DevOps, the YAML build pipelines, this is exactly what it looks like. And the great thing is, because GitHub Actions knows what different framework looks like, it could detect that even though I didn't tell it, my website was built using the Hugo static site generator. So it built a pipeline pulling in the right actions it needed for Hugo, and created that for me and checked that in. So all that was done automatically. It then kicked off the build in using the GitHub Actions workflow, you can see there. And basically that was it. It was deployed, I was up and going. And if I didn't have them in there, if you have an API directory with containing your Azure functions, it would also then build and deploy those for you at the same time. The other nice thing it did, and I didn't even notice this at first, because when I built my model, it was great, it worked, but basically anytime I triggered that flow, it automatically would update production. I didn't have in that flow the kind of the like say in Azure Web Apps, normally you might use the slots to deploy something into a staging environment to test it before you switch that into production. In GitHub, when it did all this for me, it actually created a pull request with the changes in it and created a new environment. So I can now go and hit this environment, which has got the latest lot of changes based on that pull request. I can look at them and review them before I merge it, and then once I merge it, it'll move it to the live site. So it also takes care of that that part of the life cycle, which I thought was incredibly useful. So that was kind of on the web app side. So this is now shifting gears to look at I know something close to Dan's heart, the Azure Integration Services. So this actually got a lot of announcements here. One of which I'm going to keep secret. Now, if you're interested in this area, you probably already know what it is, but I'll save it to create some kind of false tension. So I guess first thing to note that both Service Bus and Event Grid, which I actually wasn't even aware was coming, went GA with their ability to support private endpoints. So this is the ability to, rather than accessing those via domain names or IPs managed by Microsoft, they can be accessed via IP addresses from your own private address space and can be locked down to that. That's something that a lot of customers, if they're in a regulated or type industry, very, very keen on. So that was great to see those go GA. I'm going to show this because I misunderstood this at first. So they also announced the preview of Service Bus Explorer, which is a little confusing because there's an open source tool called Service Bus Explorer, which has been out for a few years. This is not that. I'll show you what that is. And I think all the other stuff we're going to talk about. Yes, we're going to talk about. Okay, so what is Service Bus Explorer? So built right into the Azure portal now is the ability to use this thing called Service Bus Explorer. So for sending and receiving and testing messages, you can do that directly in the Azure portal rather than having to use a third-party tool. So that's super, super handy for troubleshooting, for testing things out. There's a similar kind of thing in the SQL Data Explorer. It's that kind of idea. And yeah, so yeah, there is all the basic stuff, but if you tick the little box to get to see all the advanced settings, you can see you can even create all the things, you know, like the correlation IDs, the time to live, all that kind of good things that people who do messaging and service buses love to do. So that was pretty interesting. The other thing, they did announce a big increase in support for Java Messaging Service, JMS. So I'm not a Java person, but if you're in a corporate environment that still uses a lot of Java-based messaging, then there's a absolute ton here of support around that. And there was also the announcement that now can support the messages in Service Bus can go up to 100 meg per message, which is that's a lot of message. Okay, the other thing they announced, so around Event Grid. So if you're not aware, so Event Grid is the Azure eventing platform. Massive scale, can deal with raising and dealing with events that are raised either in the Azure platform itself, so what we call these system topics. So you can hook into all those. So everything from a storage account created to a blob created to something happening in your IoT hub. All those events can be fed into Event Grid and then forwarded on to event handlers that have configured themselves to receive those events. So up until now, there's been two flavors, those system Azure generated events that I mentioned, and also obviously your own custom events. So if you want to raise your own business level events or whatever you want to do, you can raise your own. There's now a third kind of family, I guess, called partner topics. So the idea of this is third-party SaaS providers, such as Auth0 is the first cab off the rank, but you can imagine lots of people use different SaaS providers to do different parts of their architectures these days. So those providers will be able to publish events that you as a user of both Azure and that service can connect to and receive. So for Auth0, it might be some kind of authentication type event. And you can publish your own topic. So if you have partners that you work with, you could use that same mechanism to package up events that your platform is providing, and then the people who use your service could also consume those. So that was an interesting direction. Another announcement was around Automation Hub. So this is under the covers. This is being driven by things like Event Grid, but within the context of your Azure resources, you can very quickly and easily configure little workflows to happen when those do. So for example, if a VM is stopped, send an email, and under the hood that's using Event Grid, but this will manage all that for you, and you can go and look at that and configure that quite easily. So that's the stuff that sort of they announced was available. There was also a bunch of stuff, I guess they did a sneak peek, or it's coming real soon. And by real soon, I think they're talking the next few months being the goal for a lot of this, but there was sort of, between now and Christmas, let's say. So one of the interesting things, if you use, for example, Azure API management, obviously you can go do that in Azure portal, but there's also a great plugin now for Visual Studio Code, so you can go in and manage a lot of this yourself. One of the things they announced that we'll be previewing soon, though, is great support built into that for managing Azure policies, APIM policies. So policies are a really powerful feature in API management that lets you both on the messages coming on the way in and on the way out. You can run all sorts of logic and transformations and do all sorts of cool stuff like, rate limiting and transforming messages and all that kind of good stuff. So that's great. And that's going to be built into the plugin. So that means you'll be able to not only come in here and edit them, but actually run them and trace them and see what the messages coming back are. So from developing those policies point of view, that will be very, very handy. The other thing, taking that even to the next level, is they announced the abilities coming to be able to debug and set breakpoints in policies. So if you imagine up in Azure, you've got your API management running, you've got a whole lot of policies, but it might be something's not going the way you think it would. you'll be able to actually, in this plugin, go and set a breakpoint. And when your message hits that, that API management endpoint in Azure, you can actually break there, step through the code. You can see in the top left there, you'll be able to look at the context of all the variables. So you'll really be able to get in and kind of track what's going on. So that's that'll be very exciting. The other announcement related to this time Logic Apps. So Logic Apps by default, so if you haven't used them, Logic Apps is the Azure serverless workflow tool. And one of the great things about it is it's stateful. So every time it goes through that workflow, it keeps very detailed state between even, so what called it, between each action in the thing, you know, what was the values at the input, what values were the output. You can come back and rerun them, and great for keeping track of what's doing. I guess the downside to that is there's a performance price to pay, because it obviously has to process that information and store it. So one of the new things they're announcing is that there will be the option to run Logic Apps in a stateless way. So you can see here in this example, this is running the same workflow. The one on the left was run in a stateful way, so it kept all its state, and you can see the runtime there was 998 milliseconds. The one on the right, the exact same Logic app, but running in a stateless fashion, only 250 milliseconds. So, you know, roughly a quarter. So obviously you wouldn't do that for all workflows, but if, you know, you often end up with a lot of sort of utility transformational workflows where maybe you don't need that. And so that's a quarter of the runtime. And in a kind of a serverless world where you're basically billed for how often things are running for, that's not only faster, it potentially could be cheaper. So this is kind of getting into the really interesting stuff now for Logic Apps. So at the moment, if you go into the Logic Apps, you can, lots of people when they first encounter Logic Apps, they go into the portal, it's got a great GUI, they can do all those kind of things. But in reality, behind what you see in that GUI is a JSON document, and you can go and edit. And typically once you move into production, that's how those are managed by putting those into a typical DevOps sort of process. So if you were editing that Visual Studio Code, you can do that right now. You can go in, open up your workflow, and you'll see this kind of thing, which is great. But what they announced is coming soon is within Visual Studio Code, you'll actually get the exact same developer experience that you get on the website. So you'll be able to go in here and edit and see or configure all these in this GUI, actiony kind of workflow tool, which I thought was good. That's nice. What's potentially even more interesting is you'll then be able to run it locally. Okay, so this is now a Logic app. You're coded up in Visual Studio Code and it is running on your local environment. How could that possibly work? Let's find out. We will find out once we've redacted the redaction. And when you do run it locally, you still get that same, if you're running a stateful version, you'll see, you can see from the URL, we're calling its localhost, so it is running on this development PC. And you can see all the run history, all the steps, all the tracing, everything you get up online, you're getting down here. So how on earth is it doing that? Because you can't run Logic Apps outside of Azure. Can you? So the reason is what's under the redacted. This little ASCII icon. So if you've ever seen that, you'll know that's the Azure Functions Runtime logo. So Azure Functions, obviously our serverless compute offering, it's been around for quite a while now, very mature. I think probably people don't realize is that it's not only cross-platform, but the runtime is open source. So you can run Azure Functions in Azure, obviously, we give you the service, but equally well, you can run them on your PC, on a VM, in a container, in Kubernetes, in AWS, in Google, wherever you want, you can run them. And I guess the big announcement is that they've adapted Logic Apps, so it will now run on top of the Logic Apps, the Azure Functions runtime, right? So that means what? That means Logic Apps will be able to run wherever Azure Functions can run. And where can Azure Functions run? Anywhere, which is why, oh, went the wrong way. If you noticed in the project file, there's a Docker file. So basically now you will be able to package your Azure Logic App up in a container and run that wherever you want to. And that's something I think that people have been asking for a long time, because now effectively we said, if you think about what you can run on the edge in Azure, For example, I can run Event Grid in a container. I can run Azure Functions in a container. And now I'll be able to run Logic Apps in a container. I can run SQL, both the full SQL and SQL Edge in a container. So we're really getting to the point where we have an integration platform that can really run anywhere. And whilst, of course, you should run everything in Azure when you can, the reality is, particularly for integration, you often need to run those integrations close to the data, and the data can live in a lot of places for a lot of reasons. So that was pretty exciting. So I think I know the answer, but I'll pause anyway. Dan, do we have any questions in relation to anything so far?
We do, actually. So I'll go through them here. There's just a couple of them. One of them is Krishna saying, hey, that's a lot of hey, that's cool. Damien said, could this be ASP.NET Core Blazor? That came in a little while ago.
I'm just trying to think back in context. Could this be ASP.NET Blazor? Oh, is that yes? So yes, that was that was the release of ASP.NET Blazor. So the client side, because when they mapped out Blazor, they kind of did lay out the timeline that they were going to deliver the server side one first, and then they were going to deliver the pure client side version. So that's now what is released.
Awesome. Okay, and then we have a question from Sarat. He wants to know how he can use GitHub to build a SQL project and deploy the resulting DAC pack to Azure.
So in the Azure market, in the Azure marketplace, in the GitHub marketplace, there's definitely actions to build that into SQL. Build the DAC pack. Yeah, it's probably one I might have to take on notice and send you some information on that, because the release part of the process is probably something I'm not overly familiar with for SQL from GitHub. But I guess in a general rule, certainly I've done that in Azure DevOps, and I guess GitHub Actions is kind of forked from the pipeline builds in Azure DevOps. But then GitHub is a very different platform, so they're then extending it. So particularly in the areas of release, they're probably still maturing there, but I do believe you can do that. But if you remind me of that, and then with the show notes for this, we'll post some links to some info on that. Great.
That's it for now. And
perfect
questions. Oh, wait a minute. Hang on. There is one more. No, that isn't. We're good.
Okay. So now we're kind of moving into the world of infrastructure, something infrastructure, because apparently it's still important. I don't know, all those infrastructure people keep telling me. So the first thing, there's a couple of announcements around Azure Stack Edge and Hub. So if you're not familiar with this, the Azure Stack family are appliances that can run outside. Obviously, there's two flavors of it. Azure Stack Hub, which is kind of a data center appliance. It's the one on the right there. So it's you buy it as a service. It's managed by one of our partners. But effectively, it runs the Azure control frameworks and everything else. So it's your little private Azure region. You can manage it exactly like you would from that. The Azure Stack Edge is the newer member of the family. It's the one on the left there, that little white box. Now there's a different few form factors, but this is the ruggedized go out in the world one. So there's a great video on the Microsoft site where we have one, for example, set up in an SUV. Which is designed to drive into disaster areas and very quickly relay that information back. So collects data from a whole lot of sensors, video cameras, all sorts of things. And in the back of the truck is a couple of these small Azure Stack edges, which processes, does all the AI and does all sorts of things. And then once you're out of the disaster zone, or once you have connectivity, it will then stream that up. So these are the kind of the two appliances, if people haven't seen them. So a couple of the announcements. So Azure Arc. So Azure, I probably have to explain that too. So if you don't know, so Azure Arc is basically the ability to manage non-Azure resources using the Azure, the same kind of ARM model and templates, policies, all those kind of things, just like it would. And they announced that the Kubernetes cluster management is now in public preview. So that's basically if you run your Kubernetes cluster anywhere, you can use the exact same control plane management, Azure policies, all that kind of good stuff to manage that cluster there. And similarly for SUSE Enterprise Linux Server. So I guess this is really focused on that idea that of hybrid infrastructure, where some of it's in the cloud, some of it's on-prem, but you can use the same control mechanisms, same security, same everything to do it. In terms of the Azure Stack Hub, so that was the bigger data center-y style one. What we're starting to see is a whole bunch of partners and third parties building solutions that sit on that. So they did announce there's a private preview now around fleet management. So looking over, being able to manage your fleet of hubs all over the place. There's also the AKS, so the Azure Kubernetes Service. The resource provider is in private preview. So you do have to get on that private preview, but that will allow you to spin up AKS on your Azure Edge. It also announced, oh yes, the GPU partitioning. So it's starting to mature here in terms of how you can divvy up and apply some of these structures. So if you have in your Azure Stack appliance a whole lot of GPUs, you can now partition those up. So you might reserve them for certain workloads, be that AI, be that image processing, whatever it is. Also announced a couple of new, what they're called edge patterns, I guess you want to call them, solution accelerators or solutions. So in Azure for a while now, we've had a FHIR-based service, which is a healthcare messaging standard. But now there's the ability to deploy that down onto the edge as a pattern, and a factory AI vision solution. So I guess getting these pre-packaged solutions like what you might have seen in Azure IoT Central, but now you can deploy those type of things down to the edge. I guess more now, that was kind of the hybrid infrastructure. In terms of, I guess, core Azure infrastructure, networking for the people who love all those beautiful blue cables. They did announce a couple of things. I'll skip that because I'm actually going to go on a couple of slides about those and explain them. Virtual machines for people with really, really big disk requirements. Azure, you can now support backup for up to 32 disks. And Azure Monitor actually got a few updates, which I, again, wasn't expecting. A lot of enhancements around the telemetry that Azure Monitor will capture around Node.js and Java apps, right? So if you're running in Azure App Service, when you deploy workloads there, you have to pick, is this going to be a Windows workload, a Linux workload, or a container workload? And whilst the Windows one was collecting lots of telemetry, the Linux one was still filling out its telemetry collection, if you like. So that they announced some great expansion to that. The Azure Storage and Cosmos DB capture for Azure Monitor is now GA, and the monitoring for Azure Key Vault and Redis cache is now in preview. And again, continuing the theme, one of the big ones is for people in regulated environments that Azure Monitor itself can now be locked down using Azure Private Link. So that's only available via an IP address from your own space. So just jumping back to those network things. So how do they describe it here? Routing preference for IaaS public IP addresses. What on earth does that mean? You may not be aware of it, but when you, for example, if we had a storage account now sitting in Azure in Sydney, if you were to, from your PC, connect to that Azure storage account or a public IP address, or anything you've got in Azure like that, when the data comes back, it actually doesn't go from Sydney out into the internet and then back to you. It actually travels over the Microsoft's global network to the POP that Microsoft runs closest to you. So for me here in Brisbane, we have a POP in Brisbane. So the traffic from that storage account would actually leave the Microsoft network in Brisbane via my local ISP to me, right? So that means you're taking advantage of the global network. So that's how it works by default. That's just how it works right now. And when you pay egress charges, that's part of the reason you're paying egress charges. So what they've announced is if you want to try and reduce the cost of your network traffic, you'll now have the option to leave the Microsoft network at the point of presence closest to the Azure service and then traverse the broader internet before it gets to you. So you'll lose, I guess, the benefit there of traveling over the Microsoft network and getting close to you, but it will the egress charges will be lower. So that'll be supported on things like, if you think storage accounts, the public IPs associated with load balancers or VMs, all those sort of things. You'll be able to go in and configure those. And that's available now for about 6, 7, 8-ish services. And I'm guessing we'll come to more. But yeah, important thing to understand, the top one, which is where it goes over the network, is what you've got now for the money you're paying, and that's not increasing. This is an option to reduce egress costs at the trade-off of some latency potentially, or probably not even latency. Volatility, I guess, is the issue, right? With the internet, it's always a little bit hard to tell what you're going to get. So this was an interesting one. So ARM templates now have a what if element. So you can literally say, if you're doing a deployment with an ARM template, you can go AZ deployment, whatever, what if, and what it'll actually do is go and run your script and then give you a little output here. You can see telling you what will happen if it ran. So you can see here some things have been deleted, some created, some modified, and you can just do it to give you that format, or you can also do that confirm version where it actually show you and then basically prompt you on whether or not you want to continue to do it. So that's very, very handy if you want to know what the impact of running something on your environment is. And I guess especially you might want to know that if it's not what you expect it to be, then you can take some action. And when you do it by default, you get this nice, pretty formatted version. You can obviously turn that off and process that as a JSON document, and you might have some scripting and automation that runs over that. The other thing that is announced in ARM templates. So often, ARM templates are great for deploying your Azure resources, but there's been other steps you needed to do outside of an ARM template. You needed to run some PowerShell scripts or some Bash scripts to do something or kick it off. So now there's a new element, if you like, within ARM templates where you can specify those scripts. So those scripts can now be brought directly into the ARM template itself. And so you can manage all of that in one place. Kind of handy. If you do a lot of work with VMs, there was quite a bit of announcements around the Azure Image Gallery. So this is a service that helps you store, manage, and distribute your the images of virtual machines. So you can see there, premium SSD storage account type, kind of nice. You can now store specialized images in the gallery. So if anyone's ever built these images, I think pretty much the last step you always do is to generalize the image so that it takes away the specific host details, so that every time it gets created, you'll get new details. So you can now store the specialized versions in addition to the generalized. And you can migrate VM scale sets from there, because it previously had its own mechanism for managing images, to this shared one. And then you can take advantage, for example, of all the the geo replication, so you can push your images across the world so they're close to where you're going to deploy them from. All those features are GA. Preview, the ability to create an image gallery image directly from a VM. So just point it to a running VM and it will grab it. Also copying image versions, because it does all the versioning of those images as well. And server-side encryption with customer managed keys. So obviously, if you do that, don't lose your keys, because we won't be able to help you. They also announced coming soon another higher level service to help you manage that process of building those images. So that's expected in the Q3. So what's that? That's the next quarter between now and September, October. A service to actually, it's almost like the orchestration of that whole process. Okay, sticking with the infrastructure-ish theme. So Azure Kubernetes Service. So this is our PaaS offering for managing Kubernetes cluster. So one of the big announcements was Windows Server containers are finally available. Huzzah. So for those people, if you're using Windows Server-based workloads, you can now deploy those into Windows servers. And you're important to note that a given AKS instance can have pools of both. So you might have Linux hosts for running some, Windows hosts for running others, and away you go. Very cool. And again, another bit of a theme this build, but the Azure Kubernetes Service is now protected by, again, Azure Private Link. So just to be clear on this, the worker nodes and the VMs that drive them have always been provisioned in your network and accessible only to your network. But the actual control plane that Azure Kubernetes Service provides was accessed via a public IP. You can now protect that via Azure Private Link, which means you can basically have a fully cut off, isolated Kubernetes environment that is managed for you by Microsoft. So it was that's a biggie. They also announced the support for spot pricing, which I'll drill into that in a minute, but basically a way to take advantage when the Azure data centers have spare capacity at a greatly reduced price, but with some caveats, which I'll talk to. I'll also put it on here. I actually don't think I put it on the slides, and I apologize, but the other thing that was announced either at build or right before build is one of the challenges in the Azure Kubernetes service is that control plane I mentioned, we don't charge you for that, right? So all that infrastructure that manages it, whatever, we don't charge you for that, which is great. The only problem is that means we couldn't give you an SLA. And the reason for that is contractually, for an SLA to work, we have to be charging you some money to have that contract exist or something. I don't know, lawyer something. So we now have the ability for you to pay us some more money, a very small amount, just enough that you can now, if you want to do that, so that you have an SLA as opposed to an SLO on the Kubernetes management control planes. So again, that's very handy for regulated industries where it might dictate that every single service they use has an SLA. So that was it. So just going back to the spot pricing. So as I said, the idea here is that you're taking advantage of extra compute capacity up to a 90% discount. So not insignificant discount. But important to understand, we will giveth and we will taketh away based on availability, right? And there is no SLA on that. So this is not something you're going to use for your core platform. But for example, if you have processes that run batch or do things that are quite happy to be interrupted and kicked off again, maybe some integration tasks, those kind of things, then that's the key. So the key to that is make sure you're using that for the right workload, but 90% discount, not to be sneezed at. Some other updates to Kubernetes. So Azure Advisor, which is, I guess, the recommendation engine that sits inside Azure. If you've seen on the portal where it's making recommendations, it might be around security, it might be around cost savings, all those kind of things. Now it understands and integrates really well with AKS. It understands Kubernetes-based workloads and will make recommendations based on that. Also a biggie that Azure Security Center will now offers protection for your AKS cluster. So again, it knows how to examine the log files and things in Kubernetes and understands what those mean and can flag those and bring those into your security center so that you get that holistic view of your Azure platform. We mentioned private link for AKS, bearing in mind that relates to the management plane. The ability to use managed identity within Kubernetes, that's something people have been asking for a long time rather than have to create your own. Oh, there you go, it is there. I didn't forget. That's that optional uptime SLA, pay us some more money and we'll give you an SLA. And preview of Kubernetes 1.18 and Ubuntu 18.4 worker nodes also available for those coming up. Kind of a related theme, so Azure Container Registry, which I feel bad, I always do it to service. I always say, it's our service for hosting containers in Azure. And whilst it does that, it actually hosts a lot more than that. It kind of hosts all those kind of artifacts that you need for cloud native type foundations, right? So everything from like Helm charts and even OCI, not just Docker containers, all sorts of that cloud native stuff. It will host and apparently Viking helmets. I haven't yet tracked down what that logo is, but if anyone knows, let me know, unless I'm right and it is Viking helmets, because that would be very cool. So a couple of announcements around Container Registry. Again, customer managed keys to manage the encryption at rest. So again, please don't lose your keys. Support for Azure Private Link, again, a bit of a theme that's now available. And also a lot of the Container Registry, the diagnostic logs are now also available and exported. Because this is a PaaS service, initially it didn't provide that level of availability. Whereas now all the things like, the authentication level events, all the different events now that pretty much that happen on the container registry will be available in the diagnostic logs and can therefore flow into any kind of auditing and management stuff you have. All right, I'll pause and take a sip, and Dan, any questions on that infrastructure-y stuff?
Yes. Peter Fitzsimon asked, hey, is WSL v2 no longer using your local profile? In other words, can you place the WSL files other than your profile?
Trying to process that. I'll have to take one notice again. I believe so. I'm sure I've got that in other places, but I've been flipping back and forth. Let me take that one to notice, Peter, and I'll come back to you on it.
Great. And the only other was not really a question. It was Sonia who published her list of MS Build sessions with some relevance to IT pros, including Teams and Power Platforms. So she's got a link there.
Awesome. Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sonia.
And I did make that disclaimer at the start. This is Todd's version of Build. This is probably not even a third of what was announced at Build. There's so much other great, and look, to be honest too, some of that Power Platform stuff is just awesome from a dev point. But anyway, thanks, Sonia. That's awesome.
And we do have one more question. It just came in from Saraf. Question around WSL2 and its integration with Windows Explorer. Do you need to enable a setting to be able to see the Linux folders in Windows File Explorer?
Not from memory. It does need to be WSL2. From my recollection, it just appeared for me. But again, let me have a look and I'll post some comments in there. But I don't remember doing anything. It just popped up once I was on WSL2.
Great. That's it for the questions.
Cool. All right. Something data. Okay. So apparently data is important. People keep telling me, especially data people. So I guess a couple of things first. So I guess we kind of tend to forget this, but there's big focus on SQL, but there's been a big investment over the last probably a couple of years on making sure Azure is a great place to run open source databases, but obviously, and so we provide PaaS-based offerings for both Postgres and MySQL, particularly useful for people who are trying to flee Oracle. So they did announce a whole bunch of stuff, including Azure AD authentication going GA, again private link support going GA, encryption with probably detecting some themes here. Bring your own key previewing in June. We're in June. I haven't seen a thing to say that's done yet, but hopefully very soon. And now we're going to get to the point where I start to go, okay, I'm not a Postgres person, but you can logically decode with WALs to JSON. So if you have WALs and you want it in JSON, fantastic. And also online migrations. This is kind of cool too. So with Postgres, obviously with the different tiers, you can move to the hyperscale tier using the migration tool. Stability fixes. Here's one I really loved, and I think hopefully I'll put a slide on it. SQL DB Edge. So there's been for a little while now. Once SQL Server was available for Linux, there's been a version available that you could run in a container. But SQL DB Edge is a little more than that. So this is a flavor of SQL, tailored, I guess, and customized to run at the edge. So we're talking here on relatively constrained devices, but also doing the types of things you want to do on the edge. Public preview, and I'm just going to skip forward. And yes, good, I did. I thought I put a slide in. I wasn't 100% sure. We're going to talk about that because that is very cool. And Azure Synapse. So, Azure Synapse Link. So, and again, I have some slides on that, so let me come back to that. So Azure SQL Edge, currently in preview, so go and grab it. So if you want to first of all, have a little look at the diagram, just to set the context here. So think on the right-hand side, we're up in the cloud, we've got Azure SQL. We all know and love it. That might be the PaaS, it might be the Elastic Pools, it might be SQL MI, but it's SQL. It's SQL kind of how we're used to using it, but we can just consume it without having to run infrastructure. Obviously, if you still have your data center, you can run SQL Server just like you always have. That's fantastic. But where SQL Edge fits into this story is even more edge than your data center, right? So this might be in the field, it might be on edge gateways, all those kind of things. and it provides all these great features, right? So it's designed around streaming data. So it's designed around getting some real-time analytics off those flows that are coming in. So if you want to think about if you've used things like Azure Streaming Analytics, which also can run in a container on the edge, think about those kind of capabilities built natively into SQL, as well as all that stuff that you need to support time series data, right? So think of IoT, think of telemetry, think of event-driven stuff. That's all built into it. AI and analytics, so it can support all the anomaly detection, all the ML stuff that's coming out in SQL is there. And it still has all that performance and security stuff that you're used to with SQL. And one of the things I was very actually pleased, because I couldn't do this previously, can also run on ARM. So you can run this on ARM-based systems, as well as x64 type systems. And I think, oh yeah, I did put a note, good, because I knew I'd forget. So currently, both ARM64 and x64 running on Linux. It will be able to run on Windows very soon, but not at the moment. But if you're using ARM64 or x64, whatever. So I've got myself a shiny new Raspberry Pi 8 gig version, and I'm just seeing how many Azure services I can run on before it explodes, and I haven't hit it yet, but this is very cool. So yeah, you could imagine a scenario where you've got IoT Edge, collecting data, running AI models. We mentioned Event Grid runs in there, so that SQL could be raising events based on anomaly detections, triggering that to Azure Event Grid, still running in your containers, all on the edge. So I was pretty excited about that one. Azure Synapse, I guess, is kind of the other end of the scale. So if you're not aware, so Azure Synapse, and I'm not a data person, so if there's people listening who are, I apologize, but Microsoft, and we've published sort of our approach to building a modern data warehouse. And if you've ever seen the diagram, there's like 8 or 9 pieces that all you build together and fit together, and away you go. I guess the data version of the static website thing. So what Azure Synapse does is encapsulate all those services and all those aspects of a modern data warehouse and a data analytics platform, and provides it to you as a service. So it's a higher order service that wraps all those up. And they made a bunch of announcements about them there. So particularly around the Synapse Studio. So this is, I guess, that trying to provide that unified management and developer experience over the top of that, integrating into using things like virtual networks. And yeah, Cosmos DB with Synapse Link. So that's Azure Synapse. The announcement at Build was around Azure Synapse Link. So if you want to think about this, that Synapse is in data processing, you typically have those 2 parts of the world, right? You have your analytics part, which is where this with Synapse play, and then you have your operational data stores, your structured data stores and things that are running your day-to-day business. And usually, to do your analytics, you would have to move and transform the data from one of those environments to the other. What Synapse Link is the ability for Azure Synapse to reach back into those operational data stores and query it and run analytics without pulling that data or building the workflows to do that. That's kind of the model. So the initial announced is that that will be available supporting Cosmos DB, but then the plan is that will then be expanded to support other data platforms like SQL and whatever. So it's about simplifying all that data movement and crossing those 2 worlds between your analytics and your operational data. Oh, look, there's a picture of it. It's not a particularly useful picture, but it is a picture. Yes, as I said, no ETL required, no performance impact on the operational database. So it's how do we bridge those 2 worlds? And we probably should get Fabio or Rod to come along and do a big session on that. Still in the data space, so Cosmos. So I think this was announced just before Build, but still worth mentioning that there is now a free tier. So this is not a reduced capability set. This is just that the first 100 resource units and certain gigs of data that you use will be free. So basically, unless you cross that, your Cosmos will be free. So that's useful both for very, very bursty workloads. So you don't know whether you're going to have a lot of traffic, but even dev scenarios and things like that. So that greatly reduces the barrier to starting to move into the power of Cosmos. C# notebooks and Connect notebooks. So on workspaces to GitHub. Very good. I actually forgot what that was referring to. Anyway, that's good. New improved Python and Java. So yeah, new versions of the SDKs, version 4, which I've started to use. Great, because I think in a lot of them, it's if you're moving from a traditional database like a SQL or an Oracle, moving to a Cosmos, sort of a NoSQL, a multi-model NoSQL database can be it's a big shift. And in that new version of the SDK, I think there's a lot of the way the libraries are structured makes that transition a lot easier. One of the other big announcements was auto scale. So this is about the ability, and this is one of the powers of something like Cosmos, is that you can automatically scale how much capacity your Cosmos platform has, because this isn't like a SQL, that's running on a server. Think of this more as under the hood, more of a microservices approach, so it can scale horizontally very, very fast. But what's new is the ability to set some custom limits on how big and you want to do this. So you might want to scale quickly, but you don't want to scale infinitely because there's obviously the more you use, the more you pay. So you can set some thresholds so that it won't go beyond that. So that you can I guess make that trade-off between performance and cost. A lot of great things. So again, targeting those workloads which are very, very unpredictable. So if you're running, an e-commerce platform or anything like that, where you don't know when the workloads are coming in, but also more and more. And I've worked on a few projects with customers during the last few months, obviously with everything going on in the health space. So they had, for example, systems that were traditionally not heavily used. All of a sudden, when something comes along like COVID, which completely blows the models, they needed to be able to scale far beyond anything they've ever even thought of before. But they didn't know for how long and didn't know how big. So something like Cosmos was a great example they ended up implementing because it gave them that kind of benefit. And this is coming soon. So in all that stuff we spoke about, it's still, I guess, that model of paying at some level for provisioned capacity. A bit like in Azure App Service, you say I want this many nodes running, and you can scale that. But whether you get 1 bit of traffic or no traffic, or you get 1 million bits of traffic, you pay the same. You're paying for that capacity you've requested. And Cosmos is the same, although it scales quicker. What they have announced, so what's coming to Cosmos is more the serverless model. So just like Azure Functions or Logic Apps, you only pay for what you consume. Okay, so this will give you that true serverless pricing model to go with kind of the horizontal scale. So this will be, again, great for sporadic workloads, yeah, very, very cool. And just, because Cosmos doesn't want to get left out, private link for Cosmos. So again, the ability to connect to your Cosmos DB via a private IP address from your VNet. And in fact, for some of the customers I've been working with, for example, they don't actually have a VNet, but they had app service, but they wanted to connect over private link. So because app service can peer to a VNet, you can effectively have a VNet and a private address space with nothing actually in it. And your app service can connect to that VNet and then route its traffic through the Cosmos DB. So if you have that particularly around data, there's often requirements to do that. Very good. And again, a bit of a recurring theme, encryption at rest with your customer managed keys for Cosmos. Again, don't lose your keys. That uses, again, Azure Key Vault as the store. And probably important to understand, it actually wraps, your data is still encrypted with Microsoft keys, managed keys, but your encryption wraps our encryption. So basically because this is really a scenario where you're worried about, do I really trust Microsoft? And of course you should, but if you in a regulated industry can't allow that, it can be encrypted with your keys on top of that, so we can't get at the data anyway. Very, very cool. All right, so moving from data, I guess, to the related AI, and I couldn't find a slide of this and I didn't have time to build one, but one of the announcements I thought was very interesting, because we're seeing more and more with AI and as it grows more powerful, there's a lot of discussion and I guess angst about how do we make sure we're building trustworthy AI. right? How do we know we're building ethical models? So, for example, if you're a financial institution and you've got an AI model that's deciding on whether or not you get a home loan, how do you provide that transparency, or how do you understand your model to know that it's not being built, the model hasn't been trained on biased data or is having unintended consequences, right? And that's been a hard problem to solve up until now, because part of, for a lot of AI approaches, the whole idea it is a black box. You give it a whole set of inputs and desirable outputs, and it works out what the middle is. You don't necessarily have visibility of it. So part of what was announced was Microsoft has released a whole bunch of tools, two in particular, to help you with that problem. So one is around trying to determine, for example, for a given set of inputs, which are the ones that are actually determining, which are the critical ones for influencing that decision to come out. So those type of things. The other one was around an audit trail. So making sure you understand when you train the model, what is the connection between what you're giving it and what comes out. So those tools are available, and they're starting, I guess that's starting to come into maturing that model, so that AI is great, but how do we make sure we're managing that in kind of an ethical way? So I thought that was pretty interesting. So in terms of actual AI services, there was a bunch of announcements around the different services. I'll just call out a few. So in fact, I think I'll go into more detail. Oh, no, I don't. Okay. So in the cognitive services, there's a whole bunch of ones around language, speech, and personalization, and I'm going to drill into a few of those in a sec. The Onyx runtime, if you're using that for your runtime models, a whole bunch of optimizations around that, and to the point now where it's running on some of the largest AI models that are around. And I'll skip that because I do have a slide, because slides. So I'll come back to a couple of those things. In the bot framework, a whole bunch of announcements. So did I put the pictures in? Yes, I did. Good. Because I read this and went, what on earth does that mean? So one of the big announcements was the GA of the bot framework composer. So bot framework is now up to, what are we up to? 4.9. There you go. So it's been around and matured for a while, and it's had a few different flavors, I guess, as it's come through. But the ability to understand language and build apps, I guess, based on that language of understanding is really progressed. But one of the things up until now that's been, to build a simple bot, you can build your Hello World bot, and that's great, very easy, not much drama. But as you build more and more complex apps and workflows and things, it's not trivial. How do you manage when you switch context? How do you understand what on earth all this logic is doing? So the bot framework composer is a tool to try and bring all that together and make the developer experience of that a lot better. And I'll show you a screenshot a sec for that. Bot framework skills were interesting. So this is the idea that you have little mini bots, specialized bots that you can then replug and reuse into different parent bots, which I thought was kind of interesting. And a big focus on the bot framework on integration in teams, because that kind of slide we spoke about earlier, with going through all the COVID crisis, lots and lots of uptake on the Power Platform and Teams, and more Teams being used not just as a collaboration tool like text and meetings, but actually as a canvas where you surface your apps and you actually do your work in Teams, regardless of where it is. So this is really around making that easier to do, integrate those bots into Teams a lot easier. In the Azure Bot Service, this was interesting too. Again, simplifying those more complex models, because often with a bot, you'll start out with the bot trying to answer the questions, but at some point you may get to a point where you go, you know what, the bot can, I don't know if bots say, you know what, but let's assume bots say, you know what, I think I need to get a human to come in and help with this. So in the Azure Bot Service, seeing increased support for helping that happen and integrations with third-party systems to make that easier. There's also the Alexa, a new channel to make it easier for you to deploy your bots to Alexa. But if we come back to the composer, I kind of went through and just kind of grabbed a couple of screenshots to give you an idea of what that might be like. So previously, you would manage Lewis separately and everything, and the overall framework for your bot would be in one place and language in the other. So this bot framework composer is really about trying to bring that together, and as a developer, show you all these different parts of the process and how they would fit together, right? So you don't need to switch between, managing your Lewis model and coming back here and doing all different things. It's trying to provide a unified framework for those. Okay, cognitive services. So these are our family of services that provide cognitive or human interaction type things as a service. So this was interesting. I haven't done a lot with this myself, but the personalizer. So the way this used to work was, so this is about things like making, personal recommendations and changing how things work. And previously, you would train a model on some data and you would deploy it, and then you could retrain and redeploy it. But the idea here is this apprentice mode, is that you can actually enable it to learn on the fly. So it'll learn in real time alongside the solution and improve it and keep going as it gets better. So starting to get very, very interesting. Speech pronunciation assessment. I'm not sure if this is the bots evaluating us, but basically the ability to analyze speech, the pronunciation of speech, and actually provide feedback on how accurate, how fluent it is, too many ums, all that kind of thing. Very, very good. Speaker recognition has been available for a while, so it's a great service for being able to, in video or audio, detect and remember individual people. That support's been expanded though to 8 additional languages, still not Klingon. I'm rather disappointed. To provide that, in those multiple languages, because apparently all the world doesn't speak English. Who knew? Computer vision, similar sort of theme, I guess, that part of the computer vision service provides text extraction from the images, and that's been expanded again, multiple languages for that same sort of capability. And again, that can be, continuing a bit of a theme. The part that will do all that is now can also be run in containers. So again, if you have an edge solution, all this cognitive service can all be happening on your container alongside your SQL and your event grid and all that kind of good stuff. And similarly, Lewis, so language understanding, and the text center I'll start that again. You can read that analysis. That's been available in preview containers. That's now GA, so you can deploy those containers in production scenarios. Fantastic. The language understanding portal has had a bit of a makeover, especially around breaking up complex requests. So as people are getting more and more experience with developing bots, we're pushing the complexity and the boundaries and around managing that. So that helps with that. Q&A maker, which is, if you want to think about this as the basically you can just feed it a knowledge base or an article or some content, and it will analyze that and effectively produce a bot for you that you can then query. Some new features in there relate to multi-use, so you can have multiple users editing the knowledge base and the content. You can now apply a role-based access control model to determine exactly who can do what. And the knowledge-based responses you send back to the user, you can now apply rich text formatting to those. So not just text, but you can make it all look pretty and I guess importantly, hopefully increase the understandability of it. Speech, more languages, better accuracy, you get the idea. Speech to text, I wanted to say something. Oh yes, 27 yellow cows, that was the thing I was getting at. So importantly here, you've seen all these services has been a huge focus on expanding the ability to use these services to as many languages and in many environments as possible. Yes, I really should have shortened these slides, I apologize. Yes. Okay, and I did mention the AI. So one of the other announcements, which was cool, I'll freely admit, I don't think it looks like this, but I couldn't find a picture of it. So I'm thinking it looks like Deep Thought. But Microsoft announced they'd built, based in the cloud, an AI supercomputer. So this is admittedly Microsoft's benchmarks, but if you trust them / us at our words, if this was benchmarked against the supercomputers in the world, it would be in the top 5. So you can see the just scary stats there, and I'm glad I'm not getting that bill, but 285,000 CPU cores, 10,000 GPUs, and an awful lot of network, which is what you need. So what this is for, this is not just because we can, but this has basically been put together to help or to support the work of the OpenAI Foundation. So you can imagine, with all the things going on in the world, very timely. The ability to access supercomputer power when you need it, when things are going on in the world, very, very handy. So I don't know it looks like that, but I really hope it does. He pauses and takes a sip. Any questions? And I'm hoping there's not too many data people listening, because they're probably going to throw things at me from the data discussion.
Sorry, it took me a second to get off mute. Yes, there are.
I thought you'd gone out for a dinner or something.
No, not yet. So, first of all, there's actually a lot of contribution of not so many questions, but just answers for people. So, Anthony said a possible answer for Sarath is WSL and Explorer is in Windows Insider Win 10 build 19603, and it's provided the link to that.
Might be it. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Anthony, for that. You got a few people asking if the video and the slides will be available. So the video for everybody, yes, I will be posting that probably within a week or two, and it will be on the BAUG YouTube site when I posted the link for that in the chat, so you can see that. As for the slides, that's kind of up to Todd.
Yeah, no, look, absolutely, I'll make these available. So the other thing I'll do once we do that, Dan, I'll post. So the videos of build itself are also all available, and they're fantastic. And when we do the video on YouTube, maybe I think underneath it we'll post links to a lot of the sessions here, particularly the ones like the Scott Hanselman keynote and things like that are great overview sessions. But there's literally hundreds and hundreds of sessions that you can, all free, go and have a look. But so we'll post some links to those as well.
Awesome. We can put that on the Meetup site too, in the chat too.
Yep.
Because usually what I also do is the news roundup slides that Damien delivers. I get those published and I put the link there in the chat.
And actually, at the end, I do have a couple of links on a slide. But one of those, so they created a page called the Build Book of News, which is the great 30,000-foot view, if you like, of build and all the different topics and the key items. And so that's a good place to start. But I'll share that at the end as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've seen that. That's pretty amazing. And one last one, again, sharing some information. Sonia discovered what the Viking helmet is.
Oh, what is it?
Container side. It is Open Policy Agent, and she's put the link there.
Okay, I would never have guessed that, because I was kind of thinking Rancher at one point, because it kind of looked like the Rancher bullhorns. But yeah, no, okay.
Yeah, so thank you. This is one of the great things about the community is you have people sharing information like this. So yeah, keep it coming, everyone. That's fantastic. And that's pretty much it for the questions.
Cool.
Right now.
Okay, well, the good news is we're on the home straight. We're into IoT, which my memory is not that great, but I'm pretty sure it was the last thing Cow had. So IoT actually had a bunch of announcements. I was really excited. Everyone knows I love my IoT. So I guess what was interesting over the last few events, probably over 12, even 18 months, you know, we've seen kind of preview and little early sneak peeks at things like the digital twins and whatever. And it's kind of, we're on this journey, and they kind of, Sam George does a great session you should go and watch. But basically, if you want to think about where we started in terms of IoT, really, we're still fairly early on. We're still interested in managing connected assets. So usually within a location, you know, we're managing stuff, you know, within a factory or you know, and maybe integrated. What's kind of emerging is this connected environment. So think about more of, you know, supply chain all the way through, you know, yeah, that's my factory, but maybe, you know, my factory has a truck and the truck goes outside and all that kind of thing. And then kind of think where we are going in the future is this idea of connected ecosystems. So for example, you know, that truck drives on a road. Now that road's not owned by me, but things can happen to that road. There's data about that road or that environment. So how do my things connect into the ecosystem of other things that they go through? So that's kind of the journey. And what we kind of saw was announcements along all three of those areas, which was pretty awesome. So think back to the beginning. So think today, where are we? So there's a new developer training and cert. So there's now an Azure certified Azure IoT developer. I got that completely wrong. You get the idea. A certified Azure IoT developer certification, which is now GA or available or whatever they call it. And also on Azure Learn, there's a lot of great resources to go and do that. So that is tremendous. So there's actually developer-specific training, awesome, and certification. The Azure RTOS, so real-time operating system, is generally available. I'll talk a bit to that in a sec. And there you go. An Azure Sphere and Azure RTOS better together. I'll talk about that in a sec. In fact, yes, IT Edge capability. In fact, I might talk a lot about this in a sec. So I've kind of put some pictures together around this. Yeah, I'll come back if I've missed anything, but I kind of went through and grabbed some screenshots to try and put context to what all these announcements are. So, probably should have done this first. So there you go. So yes, there's now a certified, and is it AZ220? No, that's the test. Can't even see it. Anyway, AZ220 is the exam, but basically it's a Azure IoT developer specialty, and you can see there on the left, there's a bunch of content on Microsoft Learn that goes with that. So if you're at all interested in that stuff, go and have a look at that. It is very, very detailed and very good. Okay, so who would have thought it? So when you talk about IoT, you need a couple of things. So at the very low level, you need a real-time operating system. So if you want to think about it, this is, if you think about a Raspberry Pi and an Arduino, and a Raspberry Pi is a single board computer, but it's still a multitasking computer. You know, it runs an operating system really not that different to what you run on your desktop, which is great, but it also means it's multitasking, things are happening. It's very, very hard for it to go very low level and be very, manage things at a very low level. So that's where something like an Arduino comes in, which is, you know, there's no operating system per se on there. You put your program on there and it just runs in a loop. It's real time. It can get lots of data lots of quickly. So it's a bit like the brain versus the nervous system, if you like. So Azure RTOS is our real-time operating system, and it's now generally available, right? So, and I'm going to show you in a sec. Let me come forward a bit and how that fits in. So you might have heard about Azure Sphere. So Azure Sphere is an operating system with a Linux kernel that Microsoft produced. And the idea here is that you can build secure, by design, IoT devices. And what's nice is basically within that Sphere device, you'll have both Azure Sphere as that high-level brain. So it looks after the security. You can see all these components that fit in there. So how do you manage hardware security? How do you store your certificates securely within the IoT device? And then at the very, very lowest level, you have that Azure real-time operating system to build things like where you really need to talk real time to retrieve electronic signals and things. So as part of the Azure Sphere ecosystem, both those parts are now there and available. So who knew Microsoft would have their own Linux kernel? Very, very cool. So, yeah, okay. So the IoT Edge itself. So this is the part of Azure IoT that actually runs and manages things as a gateway on site. So for a while we've had IoT Hub, runs up in Azure. It manages things. It can go down to IoT Edge, and you could deploy, you know, workloads to it and whatever. But what's now available, if you want to think about this, is having a layering of that. So the ability to have IoT Edge devices, and underneath that, a whole lot of IoT devices that might be managed, but one of those devices might also be an IoT Edge. So you can build these very, very complex and I guess realistic topographies of all the different devices. One of the other interesting things I thought too, so I'm a developer, right? I don't get terribly generally excited about diagnostics. I know Sonia probably does. But one of the nice things that's cuddling in this is it's also now the ability to bundle and stream all those low-level logs that are happening on all these devices and have IoT Edge manage those and send those up to the cloud when you want it. And that makes it much, much richer in terms of managing secure devices and all those kind of things. One of the ones that I was particularly interested in, is not clicking that button, priority messaging. So this is the ability to flag basically a message to say, hey, this is really important. So if you can imagine, you might have a whole lot of telemetry data going up, but you know, if you get a critical alert or something's way more unusual that you detect, you might want that message to go first. So you can pretty easily now tag that and have that go to go. And kind of the reverse is also true. You can also now with put a time to live on the messages. Basically, because by default, IoT Edge will, if it loses connection to Azure, it'll sit there and buffer them and retie and give you all that reliability. But if you have messages that really have no meaning beyond a certain period of time, it's just too long, you can set a TTL and that message then won't go. So it's kind of handy too. And I thought this was interesting, and Damien probably is looking at this going, what the? Because he's, so there's a version of Windows 10 called Windows 10 IoT. So this is a version for running on constrained devices. And the idea of Windows 10 IoT was that it was to make IoT development, I guess, accessible to people coming from a traditional Windows UWP type background, right? It had some really great features. It's been a bit quiet, I'll be honest, for the last little while. And all of a sudden there was a bunch of announcements about it, which I thought was great. So one of the interesting things was, you can see there as before, it can still run Win32 apps and UWP apps, which was, I guess, the original intention of it. That makes it really easy for people who have a deep skill base in Windows development to get into IoT. But what's interesting was this one, that the IoT Edge will also now be able to support Linux VMs on the IoT Edge as well. So that making that Windows IoT as a base platform much more flexible, whether it's Windows 32, UWP, or Linux workloads, because you often need to mix and match those. A whole bunch of stuff there. I'll leave that there. Yeah, not too good. And again, this is one that's been asked for a lot of people. I'm kind of torn about this one. So Azure IoT Hub being available over private link, and again, meaning you can get to it from your own IP address, your IOP range, and cut off the Microsoft hosted IP address. This is great. Certainly helps with that. I think this is one of those scenarios though where you really need to think through what that means. Depending on the volume of data you're sending, you need to make sure that if you're routing that traffic now through your network, that it can handle it, obviously. But you have that option now, which was all good. So basically, you can see there, right? You can lock it down, deny inbound access to your IoT hub. Good to go. Okay. Another part of IoT is this concept of IoT plug and play. So, I think we've all gotten kind of used to the wonderful world of USB and that we can just plug things in and they work. And as someone who's been mucking around with 80s computers a lot lately, you forget what the world was like when you couldn't do that. Well, working with IoT devices was a little bit like that old world. It was not necessarily easy to get them to get them configured and talking to each other and whatever. So IoT plug and play, I guess, is our attempt to provide libraries and ways to make that easier. So regardless of who builds the device, they can be certified IoT plug and play, meet in certain capabilities, so you can very easily add them to your environment. So that's GA. And one of the nice things, we're going to talk about digital twins in a sec, they've also been finessed. As the digital twins piece of work is evolving, the plug and play has been adjusted, so it now lines up with the way those digital twin definition language. So if you think about digital twins is trying to describe the physical world and relate it to the digital world, and that's been emerging over the last 12, 18 months. So plug and play has now been updated, so it follows that paradigm. So once those two together, you'll be able to not only have your device recognized and plugged into your IoT solution will understand where that is in the physical world and what that means and be able to query it and do all that kind of good stuff. IoT Central also got a bunch of stuff. Now, I actually hadn't looked at IoT Central I didn't think it was that long, but it was probably 2 months. And I was stunned when I went in there, what it's got now. So IoT Central, unlike the other service we've spoken about, which are platform as a service, IoT Central is software as a service. You can go in and create an whole IoT app and all the ecosystem that goes with it in literally minutes. And it has an amazing array of templates for it now. So, for example, everything from you know, water quality management to public safety to all sorts of different retail scenarios that will go in and configure an app template. And of course, you can define your own app templates. So one of the part of the announcements was those app templates for those industry verticals. If you go in there and have a look, you'll see how deep some of these solutions are. And these are not Hello World 101 templates. These are fully realized logistical pipelines and the whole bit. It's very impressive and worth a look. One of the other things that's new is that you can white label it. So before it had obviously the IoT Central branding on it, but a lot of partners are developing these for their clients using this as the platform. So you can now white label that. One of the other very cool things for me was IoT Edge support. So that IoT Edge we spoke about is now supported in IoT Central. So previously you could register devices to IoT Central, but it didn't support the IoT Edge level of things. It does now. Equally well, it supports Azure Sphere. Lots of very cool dashboards, improvements, API, awesome. The pricing models have changed, so it's definitely a lot more approachable now. I think initially it was the way the pricing models worked. It was fantastic if you're running a big system, but it didn't necessarily scale down. So they've kind of heard that feedback, and now it's really affordable to get going with that. And IoT Central is one of those great places that when you talk about the Power Platform, so the Power BI, Power Apps, and Power Automate, if you build a solution on this very, very quickly and easily, it's then super easy to extend that with those platforms. So if you're remotely interested in IoT, I highly recommend going and have a look at that. It's amazing what's in there. Oh, look, I've got screenshots. So here's the dashboardy stuff, all very cool. You can go and have a look. I'm just mindful of time here. Oh, we're on our last one. So Azure Maps. So, and I think, let me just double check. Yes, good. So Azure Maps, not surprisingly, it's a map service for developers to build mapping capabilities into your platform, into your application. Very, very powerful. If you haven't had a look at it, again, if you're a developer, this is something definitely to go and have a look at, right? So it's not just, show me a map with a pin on it, very, very advanced routing, searching, spatial operations, all that kind of good stuff, incorporating traffic data and all sorts of great stuff built into it. So a couple of the announcements at Build were around weather services. So both current and historical weather services, which is interesting, the satellite maps, Power BI integration with it, and probably doesn't apply to too many people here, but if you're in the US, GovCloud support. But this was the big one for me. This is awesome. So you can now use Azure Maps for creating maps of your indoor spaces. Okay, so Azure Maps previously was great for outdoor spaces and whatever, but this is basically in this Azure Maps Creator tool. You can import your CAD files for your building or environments or whatever, and base maps off those, and then incorporate those into Azure Maps to generate maps and call those APIs just as you would. And this data you're putting in here is only for you. This isn't shared with, this isn't used to train Microsoft models and all those kind of things. This is because this is kind of your commercial data or your private data, but you can use it to build, all those kind of maps for indoor spaces, which is very, very cool. And believe it or not, we're done. Done with an asterisk, right? And the asterisk, as I said, is I've not touched everything by a long stretch. There's plenty of stuff I haven't covered. There's especially stuff around the Power Platform that you should go and check out. But that was my high level, hopefully useful view from Build. Is there any questions on that last? I can't even remember now. What did we talk about? IoT, something before that. It's all blurry together.
Yep. So we do have a question from Krishna, who asked if there's any updates specific to Azure DevOps.
There was a few. I'm just trying to think. Not that I can think of that I would flag as being critical. Again, I'll post some links in the thing, but no, mate, nothing that jumps out at me. I think the focus was very clearly on GitHub at this build. GitHub separately, but also the GitHub integrations into Azure. Oh, actually, I did skip over it. There's also I mentioned the GitHub integration into the Azure portal and things, but that same integration is in the Azure CLI as well. So it's I think it was a big focus this time. So no, there was nothing huge that jumped out at me this time.
Okay, and the only other was just a comment. It's no question, just a big thumbs up to Todd and Sonia for the best of summaries, which is it's great. And yeah, on a personal note, I have to say that was an awesome, very comprehensive presentation, Todd. That's fantastic. We didn't even miss all of the flashing lights and the Commodore 64s and everything else that usually.
I did. No, but it was good. No, as I said, there's stuff there. It's interesting when you reflect on it. You know, over the last few years, like often you'll see on the Microsoft decks, there's like a few diagrams they kept showing, like the intelligent cloud and the intelligent edge and all those kind of things. And I've kind of struggled for a couple of years now, really understanding what that vision meant. But I think now we're starting to see it. You know, this idea of the number of Azure services as a developer you can deploy in Azure or on-prem or in another cloud or wherever. It's really starting to come home that, I'm starting to get this.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. So thanks so much, Todd, for a great presentation. And as you know, and people who come to our groups regularly, or when we had live meetings anyway, we always appreciate our speakers. And you know, just because we're virtual doesn't mean we're gonna dispense with presenting you with the token of our appreciation. So here's your bottle of wine.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Hope you enjoy that. Okay, well, basically, I'll just close out. There's no more questions. I'll just have a look. I think there's one more actually. Just from Sarah. Thanks for the presentation. So
you're welcome.
Yeah, that's awesome. So first, I want to thank, of course, Todd, but also everyone who attended tonight. I really appreciate making the effort. I know it's not the same as coming live, but there are some other advantages to it as well. So great. We will try to keep doing this monthly. And I don't yet know for sure who's presenting next month, but we'll almost certainly have someone. And it was great. We hope to see you then. Look on the Meetup site for announcements in terms of links for where the slides are posted or where the video is posted, and also make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel because that's where the video will be when I finally get it published. So unless Damien has anything to add, or Todd?
No, I'm good.
I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along. It's been a great session. Thank you very much, Todd, for all your work in getting the presentation up and out to everybody. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, fantastic. So great. Well, that pretty much wraps it up for tonight. So so thank you very much for joining, and look forward to seeing you all next month. Bye for now.
Thank you, guys.